everyone to part 2 of psilocybin psychotherapy for veterans. This is webinar 4 of our campaign. And for the last 2 weeks, we've been partnered up here with Heroic Hearts Project to support psilocybin access and psychedelic access to veterans in need. So thank you everyone for joining. Just as some simple housekeeping here, I'm going to mention that at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there are 2 places where you can chat and ask questions. And one of them is the chat. And that's maybe a place where feel free to throw in some encouraging words to speak to each other. And then if you have a question that you really want to ask, there's a little Q&A box there. And Holly, who's also on the webinar here, I'm sure we'll be able to answer a couple of those questions, and any questions that can't get answered will be directed to us. And we're going to make sure that this week we leave a little bit more time for questions, hopefully grabbing some of the questions from last week and responding to those as well. So again, thank you so much everyone for joining this webinar. Again, this is part 2 of psilocybin therapy for veterans. If you haven't seen part 1, it's on YouTube, and I'm sure Holly will be able to throw a link to that in the chat here. So without further ado, let's get started. So first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that I'm conducting this Zoom in Victoria and on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Saanich people. And I think it's important to acknowledge this as we're working with psilocybin therapy. It's good to acknowledge that much of this field wouldn't exist without the Indigenous knowledge holders who have kept it alive. So thank you. So I'm going to run through a quick breakdown of today's webinar. The first thing we'll do is comment on the state of the campaign, how it's going, and we'll jump into speaker introduction. After that, we'll have a discussion about psilocybin therapy for PTSD, and we'll talk about how each of the people on this call became advocates and why this treatment, and perhaps more broader psychedelic psychotherapy for PTSD, why it's needed for some veterans. We'll then also jump into, I think, the more juicy thing, how veterans can access psilocybin and ayahuasca through TheraPsil and Heroic Hearts, some of the barriers to access, and what can be done through Section 56, but also through proposed regulations. And we'll do a quick touch base on those regulations. Then we'll jump into ways we can support both organizations. We'll give a thank you to our sponsors, and then most importantly, we'll jump into Q&A and make sure everyone's questions are answered, as I know there are a lot of them. All right. So I am the host here, Spencer Hawkswell, CEO of TheraPsil, but I'd like to pass it over to Jesse to introduce what he's been doing with Heroic Hearts. So Jesse, over to you.
Thanks, Spencer. And hey, everybody, I'm Jesse, as Spencer said, and thank you so much for joining us and just wanting to learn more about this movement. So I was in the military in the US citizen. I was an Army Ranger, multiple deployments to Afghanistan. And then when I got out, I just started having pretty severe mental health issues and not a lot of options to overcome them. So I tried all the usual pursuits. I tried the USVA, and everything just was underwhelming and really wasn't effective. And so that led me on this sort of long journey, finding psychedelics and just seeing how much my stigma was incorrect and had no idea about how the power of these substances. So I founded Heroic Hearts Project, which has been, the express purpose is to educate and connect veterans in many different countries to psychedelic treatment options, but also providing parameters of support for them. So it's not just sending them there, it's seeing where they're at, making sure it's safe, and then providing guidance, coaching, and any other support that we can, while also allowing them to get to a variety of psychedelics, ayahuasca, psilocybin, ketamine, to name a few. And so we've been doing that for a number of years, had great success. Most of the veterans we serve have fallen through the VA cracks, whether that's in the US, the UK, Canada. And, you know, as we'll probably address later, this is not a magic pill, but it is a very effective option. And so we're just trying to build infrastructure where it's not there. So we're a nonprofit in the US. We recently started a branch in Canada. So that's going through the process of being nonprofit. And our main goal is just to try to be a better voice for veterans seeking effective mental health care. So very happy to be here, very happy to answer any questions. about going forward and this whole process. But yeah, Spencer, honored to be here. Thank you so much. And it's great working with TheraPsil. They've done some amazing things in Canada.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much as well, Jesse. And you've been incredible help for many of the veterans that have been seeking access to psilocybin. So there's a lot of crossover, and very happy to be working with Heroic Hearts on this. So thank you. And Chris, I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit about why you're here at this.
Yeah,
this webinar.
sure. Yeah, I'm a 19-year veteran of the Canadian Forces, and I deployed multiple times, peacekeeping, peacemaking, and then war, Afghanistan, like Jesse there. And many years later, the mental health aspects caught up to me. I sought traditional treatments. I had a lot of resources within the military. I accessed them all. Most of them were not effective, and a lot of alternatives that were supported by medical and science, but not by necessarily the mainstream government, was considered too woo-woo. Like EMDR was considered woo-woo 8 years ago. So that was pretty much my journey. I got healthy slowly through the traditional methods, attempting to get other therapies because I was knowledgeable from my own personal experiences and just education. And towards the end of my, I would call health journey, I was lucky enough to go with Jesse down to South America or Central America and have an ayahuasca experience with the New York Times doing a case study. So, and Jesse reached out to me to speak today, and so here I am.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you also for joining us, and it's an honor to have you here and have you able to speak about this experience. So I guess I want to talk quickly about the state of the campaign and where we're at. And we've helped about 35 patients and 19 healthcare practitioners get access to psilocybin. And it's obvious that among some of those patients, there is crossover with diagnoses. Although we help many people with end-of-life distress, there are also folks who fall into a category of PTSD. And interestingly enough, we've actually been able to support a patient who does have PTSD from their experience in wartime. And so the question has obviously come up, and I think this is where Jesse, our shared goals and values as organizations show, is that in Canada, anyone who needs access to any of the controlled substances, specifically, psychedelic like psilocybin or ayahuasca, should be supported instead of completely blocked, especially when they're leaving the country to access that medicine and when it's working. So I think I want to acknowledge something that you said, is that it's not a magic pill. And in fact, there is not always enough science to say that this is a medicine, and that's not always the technical term to use. But nonetheless, there are individual people who are using it, and for them, it is a medicine. And I think that's why we've been focused on compassionate access, and where, again, I see compassionate access right out the reach of our organizations. So where we're at right now is we're trying to make regulations for psilocybin in Canada, and make arguments that those regulations should show that there's a need for safety for trained healthcare professionals, and for safe access to psilocybin, and also equality. And that equality would be whether you're, are diagnosed with a terminal illness or in remission or have PTSD, that it should be up to a doctor and not a minister of health to grant you access to those substances. So this is us broadening psilocybin and showing that there is need for veterans. And I guess to start off, I've kind of got a question for both of you. And I guess, Chris, I'll just start with you. What is the importance of a focus of mental health on those returning from wartime, on veterans? How important is it that there's increased attention to the mental health of veterans?
Great importance. When it comes to that very question, I've been asked a few times, and for me, it's when I'm making a case towards professionals or the system at hand, I usually want to speak to its cost effective, its efficiency, and its investment return. Quite often, when you're speaking frontline soldiers, you're looking at a $5-10 million investment per, 10 million per se if they're a special forces soldier. And then if you're only willing to spend $10,000 in therapy on that soldier, that's a huge loss. And quite frankly, for governmental departments, that's quite easier sell than this is good for Canadian citizens. So I usually go to that first because the military is very about bean counting. And and sorry, could you? I think I got lost in the question there. The
You're on the right track, and
I have a neighbor.
The importance of a an absolute focus on mental health on veterans, both I guess in this case active service members, but also veterans, right?
And then I guess the final point on that would have been that not only return on investment for them, like if they want these people to actively continue working either in the same profession or if someone retires from a governmental position, if that's an army, a firefighter, police, and they have millions of dollars invested into them, and even if they do retire, that individual is still a citizen that can reinvest in the community in a new career and in new ways. So get them up and functioning again is, it's numbers if you want. I mean, I can speak to the emotional and the morale behind it and the reasons why we should do that. But I mean, I'm speaking to governments and ministries, it's numbers. It just makes sense. So
awesome. And Jesse, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, of the importance or perhaps even where we may be failing to look after the mental health and really look into innovations for veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. And, sometimes we get distracted by, the politics of things. And, obviously Afghanistan is in the news right now, and that's its own debate, and that's a worthwhile debate. But at the end of the day, we are in a point where these countries need military. They need people to volunteer to serve their time and to risk their life for this situation. Again, we can argue in the future if that's not the case, but right now it is the case. And so as long as that's the case, we need to realize the full cost of war. And that's not just the infrastructure, that's not just paying the salaries of veterans while they're over there, that's also the aftercare. And that's one of those things that tends to get swept under the rug because it's easy to avoid. It's, okay, well, I support the troops and they did that, but I don't want to deal with this mental health issue. And this is going to be a huge issue, but you can actually make it a much more approachable issue and much more cost-effective issue, as Chris mentioned, by doing effective treatments. The treatments we have been using in terms of the medications, and this is not to demonize medications, but to only use that and to use it in a way that's not necessarily looked after in the way that it should, adds to the burden, the financial burden of the system. Whereas we have psychedelics that are actually showing on a baseline scientific, but a huge anecdotal evidence basis that these are actually healing traumas from war. You're seeing the results from MAPS where people with treatment-resistant depression have complete recidivism of PTSD-like symptoms. And so we're not just maintaining these issues, we're actually healing these issues, which is an important factor because, like Chris mentioned, that allows these people to be functioning members of society, contribute to the economy, be citizens, and also have their family. These are not just one generational sort of issues. These are multi-generational sort of issues. We still have people in the US and I'm sure in Canada that are still having effects of the Vietnam War. And so we as a society, no matter what, this is the situation we have. We can debate that, but we have to take care of the veterans. We have to take care of the mental health. They are at the front lines of these. And so they tend to have these very severe traumas, but the rest of society also has mental health trauma. So what we learn and what we discover by looking into these things will just help the rest of society in enormous ways.
Well, and that kind of brings me into something that I found really interesting from speaking with, I believe it was you, Chris, earlier, but also with the other couple of veterans we had on last week was, I mean, the Army and VA puts a lot of resources into into caring for veterans, and understandably so. I mean, the likelihood of veterans developing PTSD or addiction is understandably much higher than the average citizen. I would love to hear a bit about, and Chris, maybe you can start this, like, what treatments did you try before accessing ayahuasca? What did you try, and what was the treatment like? I assume there was a lot of options.
Yeah, so I guess I'll couch that by saying I was very informed to ayahuasca and psychedelic, like psilocybin and psychedelic possibilities, but I knew I was within the system, so I initially went with the system. And I mean, I had talk therapy, I had prolonged exposure, which I think by most professionals should be axed at this point, but it's still very much used by the military. There's EMDR was considered woo-woo, I'd say, up until about 5 years ago in the Canadian Forces community anyways. You know, some people for it, some thinking it was literally witch doctor stuff. And that's just EMDR. So yeah, I went through all of those processes.
Could you quickly explain for those who may not know what EMDR is? What that is?
I am not a professional, but EMDR is a type of therapy that accesses the somatic system through psychotherapy and integrating the body, I would say. And I wouldn't want to speak to it much beyond that. But so it's a lot of follow my eye line while I talk to you. And there's it doesn't involve an ingestion of any medications or anything of that matter. But it's something that most psychiatrists and psychologists are qualified to do.
Awesome. Okay, so it sounds like you had a ton of opportunity to get help from the VA and from folks in the military.
Yes.
And can you speak about, so what did you find from ayahuasca that you didn't get from the more traditional route?
Yeah, sorry, I should add to what the last point I was saying there is I did, in Canada, the only treatments available, like treatment centers or resources available outside of talk therapy with a military doctor, were addiction centers. There were no trauma centers, and the only trauma centers up until I checked 2 years ago were only attachments to addiction centers. So they're not cutting edge, quite frankly. So I went through that process, and I tried to access psilocybin, ayahuasca, and even other methodologies that didn't require a medication. There was very elaborate prolonged exposure treatments down in the United States where they make you relive scenarios with actors and everything else. Because I had, like I said, I had unlimited resources, sort of. My doctor said, write down a list of everything you want and we'll basically approve it. And everything got disproved because it was American and I'm Canadian. So they would not send me anywhere, even though there was, accredited facilities or possible, treatments with psilocybin and ayahuasca. And then, sorry, then before the follow-up question. Sorry, what was the follow-up?
And then the follow-up was, what did you think you found from ayahuasca that you didn't find from those treatments?
For myself, I can only speak for myself, was there was less of the medication side effects. So the few medications I had tried years and years and years prior, the side effects were so bad that they had to remove me off of the medications. With ayahuasca and non-official psilocybin experimentation, there was never any side effects, and I only felt the benefits. So that was one of the pros, I guess, in the pro list for me.
Awesome, thank you. And Jesse, I'm wondering if you can speak a little more to that, both through your own experience and what you've seen through Heroic Hearts. I mean, what have some of the people that you've been able to support, what have some of their experiences been, and what have they found that they couldn't get from the more traditional, perhaps Western medicine model?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think from my experience and just talking to vets like Chris, unfortunately, it seems the Canadian VA actually is a little bit more open to different things, and that's the case sometimes in the US. There's sort of a common phrase in the US: if you've been to one VA, you've been to one VA. And so even if there is something like EMDR or sometimes even ketamine offered, it's not that it's accessible to every single outpost or every single VA in different states. And so that's sort of the frustrating model, to where at the base root there is the main sort of offering, which is always focused on prolonged exposure therapy or some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, and a heavy emphasis on SSRIs, on medication. And so that was sort of my route. I tried to do more holistic, of just overcoming through healthier living. And when I actually pursued the VA, they essentially told me that unless I was willing to go on medication, there's a limited amount that they could do for me, which was just like, I can't do anything for you unless you're doing this thing that you don't want to do. And that's sort of the case of so many of the veterans. The vast majority of those that seek help through Heroic Hearts have gone through the VA system, fallen through the cracks. They have tried it for 10, 15 years easily, have been on dozens of medications. And that's not an exaggeration, because there's so many issues with medications like Chris, and then they just kind of keep stacking them on. And then the thing with SSRIs is they're effective, but sometimes they're not. And then it's either adding to that or changing it. And then it just gets to this sort of medication mess that's very hard to come down from. And the vast majority, and this is even backed up by evidence. If you look at the MAP studies, the average time the people that they served who had treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder were in therapy, I think 15 to 17 years. So this is not just me exaggerating. This is actually a documented sort of thing, where people have gone through the accepted therapies for so long with limited effectiveness. And when you do that and it doesn't resolve your issues and it's more of a maintenance program, that leads to a situation of hopelessness. And if you look at the veteran suicide rates around the world, that's where hopelessness leads. And that is the most tragic part of, you're trying to help somebody and they just get to the spot that nothing can help me, because those are the only options. And if they don't work, then you're out of luck. And just sort of a quick, for people who don't know, EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, sorry. But the basic method of it is the trained therapist will move an object or their finger in front of your eyes to trigger almost like a rapid eye movement, like what you do in REM, in sleep. And the hypothesis around it is that it actually changes the trauma in sort of temporal, how it's temporally stored in your brain. So it's not affecting you right now. It's something that you viewed in the past and you can actually move on from. So that's sort of actually been a very effective therapy. But again, it's as Chris said, it's can be effective in a lot of places, but it's still not rapidly used and across the VA system.
That's very interesting, and something that you kind of touched on. You know, there was limited support. I wondered, did you ever, during your time with the VA or even in an active service, someone's got a great question here saying, how do you start using hallucinogens, specifically psilocybin, as an effective treatment to soldiers who are told during active service that these substances will get you kicked out, or even worse? Even before we start changing hearts and minds to the regulatory side, I mean, what was some of the stigma that you faced in trying to access these medicines? Were your fellow soldiers against it, supportive? What about the doctors and psychiatrists at the VA? I mean, what obstacles did you have to overcome to, what I see is, put matters into your own hands and find your own solution here?
Yeah, so I mean, I pursued this after I was out, and we do have people that are still in that are asking for it, but it's tricky, just because, you know, this can get them kicked out. It can make them lose their pension or what have you, and that in itself is traumatizing. Even if you heal sort of the psychological issues, if they go back and have they're kicked out of the military and they have no pension, then there's only so much you can do. So I mean, that's why we're pushing this forward, to bring the conversation to where it's less stigmatized, to open up access. I know Rick Doblin is trying his best to push MDMA for active duty soldiers so they don't have to wait till the end of the line to pursue this. For me and for others that I've worked with, I didn't tell anybody. I didn't want that sort of baggage of people's judgment going into it. I just knew I was at the end of my rope. And so I made a decision that was best for myself, and really didn't know what I was doing, but I followed my intuition because there wasn't guidelines back there. It was just me, taking a leap of faith. And that's what we've been trying to establish with Heroic Hearts, of giving that support, that education, and telling people, no, they're not crazy, or they're not going to be, go crazy doing these substances. These are actually viable options for them. And I've been surprised within the military side of things. The guys I served with, they're very open to it. They're very, I think it's sort of that military training. Like if it works, it works. Like when you're in the field, like you got to use whatever tools you have available, and you trust each other's judgment. Like the word of mouth has been the biggest increase in the people seeking our program. It's not some higher level doctor, whoever, that is advocating for it. It's the brotherhood, it's the sisterhood that is what's pushing this forward, because we trust each other, because those are the reasons we survived. The rest of it, it's been sort of a wave. When I first started Heroic Hearts, it was kind of the like, you're doing what now? Like, are you crazy? But because of the more media around it and the more research, major universities like Johns Hopkins, the great work by an organization called TheraPsil, other organizations around the world that are pushing this forward, it has done a huge amount to destigmatize. So now, like, people you wouldn't even expect are pushing forward. There's a well-known Republican in the US, Rick Perry, who is the governor of Texas, who now is a big psychedelic advocate. So that's just to show you how much it's changed in the past couple of years.
We'll have to get him on to try and speak with him. But thank you for that. And Chris, I would direct that at you too. I mean, what kind of challenges did you face around the stigma? Were you able to share your experience with friends and family, or did you have to hide it?
For myself, similar to Jesse, it was more after the fact, after doing a great deal of healing through traditional modalities and whatnot, that I got to experience the psychedelic treatments. But knowing, I mean, I can't speak for every member of the Canadian Forces, but the culture is pretty open-minded. It's not like the movies. It's not it's a pretty forward-thinking organization that's willing to use whatever works, as long as it's, and within the structure, the actual hierarchy and bureaucratic process, my opinion, it's mostly they just need to know what the rules are. How long until this soldier can fly a plane? How long until he can do this? If he gets in trouble, can I yell at him? They just want a set of 5 rules that outlines what they can and can't do with this individual. Or how it'll work, or how deployment will work. Most, I would say, members of any fighting force don't care about any of this. It's just trying to get the civilian oversight to allow it through the medical community.
Okay, thank you for that. And it's a it's a good point you make, that they're willing and open-minded to try new things. I mean, what I've heard from many of the doctors that we've spoken with that work with veterans and even in active service have shared similar thoughts, is that it's not that it's impossible, it's that it's, you have to be careful. And, there's a question here that I'll direct to both you at this point, because I want to make sure that through this, we're, no one's bad talking the VA or any of that. And I want to make sure that's not the point here, because they ask, are there specialized services for mental health while on active duty, or is it just upon returning? And why do you think the VA is so far behind in terms of implementing more current treatment options, and acknowledging that most mental health services are relatively slow to evolve? And I'll quickly just state what was discussed at the last conversation we had, was that the military in general is actually far beyond the civilian system, and that they are innovative and working, but that these problems that we're facing are so extreme that even being 10 years ahead doesn't mean that you've got solutions. And I think it sometimes necessitates looking and innovating, and sometimes innovating is really thinking outside the box of sometimes an entire medicine system that you've had, and going back to see what's worked before. So I put that to you and Jesse. I mean, do you want to comment on what, again, the services were like during your service or active duty, and maybe were they also around upon returning, and maybe the differences in them that you might have noticed?
I could speak to the growth I saw within the Canadian system anyways. When I first joined, it was still right around the time of September 11th. So Canada at the time was very much for about 40 years on a peacekeeping footing. But then we deployed to overseas and started getting into conventional warfare again for the first time in decades. So that was Afghanistan. All of that started the new mental health discussions, the new programs. They didn't even know how to deal with a soldier coming home with PTSD. Like, it was like we were starting a war effort from scratch. So within that time, I would say from, the 2001-ish to, for us, we shut down our mission in 2012 in Afghanistan. There was massive growth from, at the very beginning, they didn't even know how to deal with PTSD. It was like relearning, we had older generals calling it shock, or shell shocks, or really ridiculous things. And then within 10 years, we had soldiers doing EMDR and some getting approved for things like marijuana and things like that on a case-to-case scenario. So I think, hopefully that can be repeated in a faster way again. So.
Awesome. Anything to add there, Jesse?
Yeah, it actually, just from my experience, and I'm sure people can debate me on the very fine details, but from my experience, I've actually seen the Canadian VA be steps ahead of the US VA. Unfortunately for the Canadian veterans, unfortunately for the US veterans, in terms of actually having access to cannabis and physicians able to talk about it and work with veterans with it. And then also we've been able to get people full support for ketamine therapy, ketamine assisted psychotherapy, which is huge. And they have some aspect of that in the US, but it's been pretty abysmal in terms of the rollout with, just the normal. And to your point, Spencer, the people in the VA are beautiful people, and they're working, they're working hard, and there's a lot that reach out to us. There's one woman, Rachel Yehuda, who's been really pushing forward this sort of coalition with MAPS and the VA. Others, Lynette Averill in Texas, really helped push that bill down there. People all across Texas, Chris Stoffers in Oregon, amazing people pushing this forward who really just want veterans to heal. And when they see the effectiveness of these treatments, they're full on board. And so it's not to demonize the people or anything like that. It's more to demonize the system. And when we say the VA, it's just sort of that easy target that everybody knows. And so in the US, and the systems work a little bit in the Canada and in the US, we're very much limited by the federal side of things, where these substances are Schedule I and they're restricted and nothing can really happen because the VA is federal. In Canada, it seems a little bit more open because, like what you guys are doing at TheraPsil, where there's this compassionate side, this compassionate access. And I think that word itself should be very much emphasized, compassion to these people that are suffering and have found no other means. So in the US, it's just a slow moving giant. It's just the nature. It's one of the largest healthcare providers in the world. And so as much as they try to be innovative, it's just a limit of the system itself. It's very hard for something that size to change. And then there's the restrictions on the federal level. And then that moves into all sorts of other geopolitical or economic, political sort of systems, which gets far more complex. But it's getting there, and that's why the campaigns, and that's why things like this, where people actually hear the stories of the impact on an individual's life, and they also can see the science behind it, are the most effective ways, because we are the ones with the voice. We need to put pressure on these systems. And we need to show that they are effective, and that's how you get things to change. And that's how, like with the VA, they at the end of the day do want to do good for veterans. And so if we show them enough evidence and stories, then enough people will listen. And that's what's happening right now.
Well, exactly. And, I was asked a question today by someone, and they were asking me, do you think we're better off because we now have access to cannabis? And they had a couple good points about how, in some ways, cannabis regulations have not served some Canadians. And there's data to back that as well. And I think when we talk about the regulations that we're putting forward, making sure that it's backed by data and continuously looked at and updated based on what the data is showing us is important. But without regulations, there's no data. Without regulations, we don't know what's going on. And so you ask yourself, would we have been better if we had never made regulations and if people continued to use the black market? And I think everyone can agree that the answer would be no, because we just wouldn't know. There would be no eyes. And so it's almost like this is something repeating, if you're in Canada, we have, the control boards around liquor, and their the idea behind them is government run. They want to know what people are using. And I think that in this same way, regulations are better than the alternative, which is turning a blind eye, whether it's doctors, therapists, or the government, and enforcing that situation. So I do want to get into a situation now where we talk about, and I realize we're going to jump into questions in a moment here. I mean, what do you think the goal should be or what is the goal of Heroic Hearts in terms of helping people get access? I'll share openly that the goal with TheraPsil is to help veterans and anyone in Canada. In fact, our mission is for Canadians in medical need to be able to access psilocybin with doctors and therapists. I mean, do you see a similar goal for Heroic Hearts? I mean, what do you see as a means to an end for helping veterans access psychedelics?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the broader picture, the goal and what I hope for Heroic Hearts is to be that veteran voice, that independent, trusted veteran voice that is not there. And going on the VA discussion, the VA is a healthcare provider and it's reactionary. There's not any organization that listens to the veterans on the ground and takes credibility in what they have to say, takes credibility in what they're suffering from, and listens to possible solutions, even if they seem a little bit, outside the norm. And so that's what I hope, and that's what we're trying to do. Psychedelics is the big focus right now, and I think it will be a mainstay in mental health care. But just generally having for veterans that resource where they can know that this is not manipulated by money, by pharmaceutical companies, that is actually advocating and listening to them and will take their word for it and pursue that, is a much needed sort of resource. So on the side of psychedelics, I mean, that is where the energy and the force is, because these are, if you are at all well versed in this situation, it is absolutely inevitable that these are going to become a crucial part in some way of mental health. And the fact that they have been prohibited for so long is a travesty. And so, we're going to try to do our best to push this forward to what you say in logical steps forward. It's not just like, I want everybody to have psychedelics right now. It's how do we develop these protocols? How do we push this forward to where we're actually supporting people going through this? They feel safe, they have means of doing it, but we're doing it in an intelligent way, a sustainable way, and in a way that is actually respective of where these come from, the traditional sides of where they come from, the indigenous sides of where they come from, and not just try to market it and make money off of it. Just real quick on your point of cannabis evolved in a artificial environment where there's clearly medical potential, but there's clearly some abuse potential as well. But because it was either or, there hasn't been able to develop a real sort of system where people know how to use it effectively in a therapeutic setting, because it was one or the other. You had to either do it underground or there just was no in between. And so we're just now at the beginning of doctors being able to develop protocols and work with people of what are the ratios of THC, CBD, the other cannabinoids that is actually effective for veterans, and how can they use that in a moderated sort of level. And so fortunately, we are in that situation, but it's not an either or, and that's where the detractors always try to go of like, oh, well, now this is causing all this kind of stuff. It's not that. We need to expand our our viewpoints and our conversations beyond just the black or white. There's no good or evil. It's just how we use this and how we, communicate and talk forward and study these things.
Awesome. And again, I think that where we see overlap in the organizations is education. It sounds like you are that helping hand in the education for people who want to learn more about how they can access ayahuasca, because it's and other psychedelics, because I mean, there are many people who will just find it, their own way. And I think that that's what's happened, like we talked about with cannabis. It seems to be what's happening today with mushroom dispensaries opening up all over Canada and the US. There's an option. The government can support, it can help make it safer, help educate. And I, thank you for all the work that Heroic Hearts does in helping facilitate that. If people want to learn more, where can they learn more? Where can they read more about Heroic Hearts and potentially get in touch if they're in need, if they're a veteran in need of support?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Spencer, for all you guys have been doing. You've been, steadfast and courageous in this movement. And I'll say one more thing. Community is the key to all this. Community is the key to mental health, and prohibition or illegalization prohibits community. And community also regulates. Community allows support and proper protocols. And so that's what we've prohibited for the past 50 years. So, I mean, that's what we're both trying to establish with these calls, with just conversations on a day-to-day basis. You can find us heroicheartsproject.org. We're a nonprofit in the US. We're working for it in Canada to better help veterans in the Canadian area. Canadian area sounds stupid, but yeah, so we're on all social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. If you're interested to learn more, just reach out to us on any of those. We do work with both Canadian and US vets. If you're looking to access some of these treatments right now, just reach out to us. We do offer retreats of different psychedelics. But yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. And Chris, just to make sure, are there any closing remarks that you might want to make here? I think we're going to jump into the question and answer period. I mean, first of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us and being willing to share your story and experience. Is there anything you wanted to add to what Jesse had said, or anything just to close up this session that's been mainly focused on you and Jesse?
I think Jesse and everybody kind of touched on it. This is happening. It's almost, I'm sure more better than anybody that it's almost frustrating to have to go through the motions, I think, because this is going to happen in the system, and the regulatory system is going to have to catch up. So it's just, I'm grateful that your organization and Jesse's organization's out there laying the groundwork for when this inevitably happens. So that's great.
Well, Chris, again, thank you for joining us too, because I think that's something that Jesse would probably agree with, is none of this happens unless advocates, the advocates who are those who are touched and affected by these substances, speak up and tell, about their stories and share it. So it does take a collective voice to stand up and fight the taboos, and to do it in a way that's not damaging, right? To do it in a way that's, not over and exuberant, and protecting people. So I guess that in a way is the community that you're talking about, Jesse. Something I always like to reflect on is how dangerous substances like tobacco and alcohol are. Yet finding myself very privileged and lucky to have grown up in a family that had a community around those substances, and taught me how to respect them. And I'm happy to say that they're an enjoyable part of my life. And as much as they are powerful, I also have a community that supports my use around them. So that can be the case for other substances if we let them. And we've tried prohibition on those and it didn't work. And I think, as you're saying, Chris, it's a matter of time. What we're not asking, we're not asking for the recrealization. We're asking for support for those in medical need with their therapists, with their doctors, with practitioners, so that it's done safely and not dangerously. So thank you all very much. And I'd now like to direct some questions your ways from the audience here in the Q&A. So the first one, and feel free just either of you to speak up, raise a hand, or or just answer, but I'll also maybe add if there's anything I can. But Emdr is curious, in terms of actual experience with psilocybin, what do you think is the healing mechanism? Was it about the experience that led to a resolution of the symptoms that you were experiencing?
I think, Chris, if you want to go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I think it's at least a threefold thing. And that is the beauty of psychedelics, is that when we have prescription medication, they generally work on one sort of receptor, or blocking or allowing, whereas psychedelics are very complex and they have a very complex relationship with the brain. And so on one side, there is that psychiatric side of it, where it's almost a weird enhanced prolonged exposure therapy, where you're in this world, you are faced with issues, you are faced with trauma, but you actually have to face them, and you are experiencing them and processing them through emotions, through the experience itself. On the other side, there is a lot of evidence that it actually does heal the brain. The specific mechanisms we still don't know, but we're looking into it, possibly anti-inflammatory effects, possibly neurogenesis, all these increased plasticity, all these things could have potentially positive effects physically on the brain, especially for people like Chris and I, who were exposed to a lot of concussive force explosions that had damage to the brain. The third I'll say is spirituality, is that we are spiritual creatures. And that doesn't mean, religion, that doesn't mean necessarily that, but it does mean connectivity. It does mean connection to the community, connection to the world around us, and also our where we stand on a much bigger basis, where we fit into this whole picture. And oftentimes we lose that. And I think that's important, and one of those things in mental health that we don't address regularly. And so I think when you go to a psychedelic experience in the proper set and setting, all of those things can be exposed to you, healed in you, and have you explore them to where you can get to a better plane in the future.
Chris, is there anything you wanted to add there?
That was great. I would just, I think I would add that quite often, I'm not a doctor, but the pharmaceuticals are treating symptoms or masking or doing a number of other things. But whatever psychedelics, psilocybin or ayahuasca is doing, it's not masking symptoms. You're not taking it every Tuesday and Wednesday of the week, taking 3 pills. You know what I mean? It's something to get better, not to take this until you die. So that is one line of thinking that really just that mentality, whether or not there's scientific evidence to back that up, that mentality for an individual going through a healing therapy alone, I think is amazing. And then for myself, it was just I think it's especially for highly trained individuals, those grooves get deep, and that is science. I mean, there's a lot of science in our training. They spend millions studying how to train us and then training us. And that goes back centuries. So to undo that training, and there has been evidence that that allows for communication between the left and the right side of the brain, and that maybe helps you open up new neural pathways, as Jesse said, plasticity. That's what it feels like, but I can't say what it is.
Well, that's awesome too. And I mean, I think that's it, is not being able to say what it is sometimes okay. And when we talk about compassion versus science, this has been something that we've been working very closely with Health Canada on, is they keep directing us towards clinical trials. But we need to realize that if clinical trials is the only way to help people who are currently accessing their medicine and whom it's working for, you need not understand anything more that it's working for this person, help them get access. And, it reminds me of a Socrates quote that I'm the wisest man alive, for I know one thing, and that's that I know nothing. And how do we expect to know exactly what that mechanism is going to be? It's the brain is the most complex thing, in the known universe, perhaps. And to think that we need to fully understand it before we make it available is perhaps an impossible task, but also one that, as you were saying before, Jesse, there are so many people, pushed to the brink of sometimes suicide that can't wait, and that are accessing it now. And perhaps one thing that we can know if we choose to know nothing, is that it is working for some people, and that those people deserve compassionate access. Another question, Jesse, this is from Marcia. Do you know of the Save a Warrior program? And I guess it's more of a comment too, but they feel that Heroic Hearts may be a good fit with them.
Hold on, I'm on mute. Maybe I'll have to look into it. If you have an introduction, I'm definitely open. I come across a lot of organizations, so it's not any detraction to Save a Warrior. But please, if you have a website or introduction, please connect us. What we're trying to do is psychedelics and this side of mental health is one piece of the puzzle. It's not, again, going to that magic pill. It's not going to cure every issue, every ailment. The goal is to build this infrastructure to where it's not just this, you go into the doctor, they give you a pill, you go home. It's a much community and other mental health processes and connection to positive life habits like yoga, meditation, walking through nature. All of these are key. And I think we lose track of them, especially if you have mental health issues. It's very easy to get into this hole. So we are actively always looking to work with other organizations. We are one piece of it. And if we all start working together as veteran organizations, it's going to be a much more effective system for veterans from the beginning to the end.
Awesome. And it sounds like that also answers then Jake's question, asking about if there's any opportunities for private sector companies to help you out. So I would say, Jake, get in touch with Jesse through Heroic Hearts.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another question here.
There's no, I was just going to clarify, like, we are a nonprofit, but that's not a detraction against for-profit. I mean, we do live in a system where you can make money, and it's all about how you're making money. I think we can all agree on that. You know, there's a lot of amazing organizations that are for-profit that still have good ethos, that still have social benefit. And so we're definitely not opposed to that. It's just a question of how much, our morals align and what the end goal is of all this work.
Absolutely, and well said. It's something that we always have to consider too, right? Being a nonprofit, but also being able to work with the for-profit industry. I mean, it's the way of the world. It is what it is, and you're absolutely right. It's the ethics and morals of all of those people working in those organizations using, a for-profit motive. Pharmaceutical companies are for-profit as well. They help, and sometimes they hurt, but they help a lot too. And I'm thankful that there is a nonprofit leading the way, such as your own and such as TheraPsil, that are able to make sure that patients are always put before profits. So here's another question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to this either. Does psilocybin have impacts on the therapeutic relationship? I'm thinking about how MDMA can improve trust and rapport with therapists, and I'll quickly answer what I've learned anecdotally from the research and patients that we've supported, is that absolutely psilocybin can have impacts on the therapeutic relationship. It can allow people to impact, in fact, many different aspects of their relationships with other people too, and create trust and bonding. I guess Jesse and Chris, did you feel that through any of your time using psychedelics that you were able to better improve or see impacts in the therapeutic relationship that you had either with your therapist, or because many times even your social environments can be therapeutic with other people?
I did not. Unfortunately, I was unable to access them through the regular system. So I got access through a more spiritual means, shamans. But I could see how that would be greatly beneficial, because especially within people that are within departments, governmental, it can be a real issue, because it's for military members I can speak to. They almost become paranoid with who knows what and how much. So they don't want to risk their careers. They don't want to risk pensions. They don't want to risk medical treatment or just social stigma. So yeah, I mean, if there is quite often, I have seen time after time soldiers unable to get a psychiatrist, social worker, of anything of that nature where they can get a relationship going. So if that is seen to be beneficial, then that would be amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say effective care builds your relationship with the therapist. So if they are offering you something that is actually effective, then you're just obviously going to have a better relationship. Somebody like Chris, who went through probably massive amounts of prolonged exposure therapy where it feels like you're beating a dead horse. And if you look at that program, there's massive amounts of dropout ratios or percentages, then yeah, you're probably not going to think that highly of your therapist. So actually having effective modalities to do that. Beyond that, one of the beauties of psychedelics, and I think this goes into the spirituality point I made earlier, is there is this connectiveness, there is this beauty in the world that maybe you lost, or maybe it's been a while since you've connected to. And so that in itself, especially in hard sort of journeys and hard trips, when you come out of it and you're supported by this group, whether it's the practitioner themselves or the other people living or suffering around you, there's a tremendous bond. I've seen some of the strongest bonds formed in the shortest period of time during psychedelic retreats, and long lasting. It's not just this artificial, superficial, a couple of days and then it's gone. Like, I'm still on group chats that formed years and years ago. And so that's the same sort of thing with the therapist. If they are really looking to help you and they use these modalities, and it's the relationship. It's not this hierarchical sort of situation that we've found ourselves with. It's the relationship of each other, supporting each other, peer support, wanting the person to get better. And it can really add to that bond.
Wonderful response, and thank you very much. I just want to make sure that we're closing things up on time and letting everyone get back to their families, their busy days, and if it's beautiful where you are, beautiful weather as well. So that's our hour up now, and I just want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, Chris and Jesse. Thank you so much for coming here and sharing your experience and stories with everyone. It really means so much, and we've got so much amazing feedback from all the viewers who have been watching these. So this video will go onto YouTube, and it's going to reach a lot more people. So really, thank you so much. And everyone who's joined this call, everyone who asked questions and been commenting, thank you as well. I just want to say that if you're interested, I know that both Heroic Hearts and TheraPsil are publicly funded. So if you like what we're doing and you support it, I speak for Jesse here, I'm sure too. If you're able to donate to either of our organizations, please do that. That's what allows us to continue to, I think, do what sometimes the governments or other organizations are unable to do, and that is advocate and raise the voices of those who are not always heard. So please, if you can, donate. And thank you so much to everyone who already has donated to TheraPsil. And I encourage you to see who those donors are on our website if possible, and to become one if you're interested. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Spencer. Appreciate this.